Billionaire was cold and distant, until his ex accidentally sent a photo holding a baby in the hospital. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Jules Moreau pressed her back against the mahogany door of Grayson's corner office, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breathing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the evening sky, but she couldn't focus on the beauty, not when her heart was breaking. "So, that's it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. 4 years and you won't even consider it?" Grayson Hale stood with his back to her, his 6'2" frame perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His dark hair was styled with precision, not a strand out of place, and his broad shoulders remained rigid as he stared out at his empire below. When he finally turned, his steel-gray eyes held no warmth. "Jules, we've had this conversation." His voice was measured, clinical. "I told you from the beginning what I wanted, what I could offer." She pushed herself off the door, taking a step toward him. Her auburn hair caught the light from his desk lamp, and despite the pain etched across her delicate features, she looked beautiful. Even now, even as she was walking away, Grayson felt that familiar tug in his chest that he'd learned to ignore. "What you could offer," she repeated, shaking her head. "Like love is a business transaction, isn't it?" He moved to his desk, straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. "Two people, compatible goals, mutual benefit. We work well together, Jules. We have for 4 years. I don't want to work well with someone, Grayson. I want to build a life, a real life." Her green eyes blazed with frustration. "I want Sunday morning pancakes and tiny shoes by the front door and chaos." The word cut through the air like a blade. "You want chaos?" Jules laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you think love is? Chaos? I think love is what people call it when they can't control their impulses." He straightened his cufflinks, a nervous habit she'd learned to recognize over the years. "I built Hale Biotechnologies from nothing, Jules. I have 12,000 employees depending on me. I can't afford distractions." "Distractions." She tasted the word like poison. "Is that what I am to you?" For a moment something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe even pain, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You're the best thing in my life," he said quietly. "But you want more than I can give." "You mean more than you're willing to give." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of love and growing incompatibility. Jules had known this day would come. She'd felt the distance growing wider with every conversation about the future, every careful deflection when she mentioned children or marriage or anything that looked like the traditional family she'd dreamed of since she was a little girl. "I can't keep pretending that what we have is enough," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't keep waiting for you to change your mind." "I won't." His honesty was brutal and final. Jules nodded, blinking back tears. She'd known he wouldn't lie to her even now, even when a lie might have been kinder. She walked to his desk and slipped off the key to his penthouse, placing it gently on the polished surface. Then she removed the delicate silver bracelet he'd given her last Christmas, the one with the infinity symbol that had made her heart race with possibility. "I love you, Grayson," she said, her hand on the door handle. "I always will. But loving you was never going to be enough for either of us." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Grayson alone with the city lights and the echo of her words. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, then picked up the bracelet she'd left behind. Outside his office, Jules pressed the elevator button with a trembling finger, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She didn't know it yet, but in 8 months, a single photograph would change everything between them. What she also didn't know was that 3 weeks later, she would discover she was carrying Grayson Hale's child. What would you do if you had to choose between the love of your life and your dreams of having a family? 8 months felt like a lifetime, and a blink of an eye all at once. Jules shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, her body exhausted but her heart fuller than she'd ever imagined possible. The private room at Mount Sinai was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle sounds of her 3-month-old son sleeping in her arms. Ezra Hale Moreau. She'd given him Grayson's last name, though she'd never told him why. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was love that refused to die, even after all this time. The baby stirred slightly, his tiny fist uncurling against her hospital gown. Jules couldn't help but smile through her exhaustion. Those eyes, when they opened, were unmistakably Grayson's. The same intense gray that had captivated her years ago, now reflected in this perfect little face. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text from her sister Natalie asking for an update on Ezra's latest checkup. Jules reached for it carefully, trying not to disturb the sleeping baby. As she scrolled through her contacts, her thumb accidentally brushed against a name she hadn't seen in months. Grayson Hale. She'd kept his number, though she couldn't say why. Some masochistic need to remember what she'd lost, perhaps. Without thinking, she opened the camera and snapped a photo. Ezra looked so peaceful in her arms, his dark hair, Grayson's hair, catching the afternoon light streaming through the hospital window. She looked tired, but radiant, wearing the soft smile of a woman completely in love with her child. Before she could stop herself, she typed a caption, "My little miracle." Her finger hovered over the send button. For just a moment, she imagined what would happen if she sent it. Would he care? Would he even respond? Or would he see it as the chaos he'd always claimed to despise? Jules closed her eyes, remembering their last conversation, the pain of walking away, the months of silence, the positive pregnancy test she'd stared at alone in her bathroom, knowing that calling him would only confirm what he'd already made clear. He didn't want this life. She'd tried once, early on. A single phone call that had gone straight to voicemail. She'd hung up without leaving a message, her pride wounded by the reminder that he'd probably blocked her number. Her finger moved before her mind could catch up. The photo sent, with a soft whoosh. Jules's stomach dropped immediately. "No, no, no," she whispered, frantically tapping at her screen. The message showed as delivered, but she quickly deleted it from her end, hoping against hope that he wouldn't see it in time. But across the Atlantic in his London office, Grayson's phone had already lit up with her name. Meanwhile, Jules clutched Ezra closer to her chest, her heart racing. Dr. Martinez had warned her about the emotional volatility that could follow childbirth, especially when dealing with it alone. But this felt different. This felt like she'd just opened a door she'd worked so hard to keep closed. "It's okay, baby," she whispered to Ezra, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting him or herself. Mommy just made a mistake, a really, really big mistake. Her phone remained silent. No response. No acknowledgement. Maybe he hadn't seen it. Maybe his number had changed. Maybe he was in a meeting and would never even know she'd reached out. But deep down, Jules knew better. Grayson Hale noticed everything. He controlled everything. And now, whether she'd meant to or not, she'd just shattered 8 months of carefully maintained distance. Ezra opened his eyes then, those startling gray eyes that were his father's legacy, and looked up at her with the kind of trust that could break a person's heart. Jules felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming weight of loving someone so completely while knowing that his father might never feel the same way. 3,000 miles away, Grayson Hale was staring at his phone screen, trying to convince himself that what he'd just seen wasn't real. But the image was burned into his memory now. Jules, beautiful and glowing, holding a baby that looked disturbingly familiar. His assistant knocked on his office door, but he didn't hear it. All he could think about was getting to New York. The elevator at Mount Sinai Hospital moved with excruciating slowness as Grayson watched the floor numbers climb. 7th floor, 8th, 9th. Each ding felt like a countdown to something he wasn't prepared for, but couldn't avoid. He'd left London 6 hours ago without a single word to his board of directors. His assistant had canceled 3 international meetings, a conference call with investors, and a dinner with the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee. Grayson Hale didn't abandon his schedule, ever. But here he was, standing in a hospital elevator at 2 in the afternoon, still wearing the same Tom Ford suit he'd put on that morning in his Mayfair penthouse. His usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain, his tie slightly loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it during the flight. The elevator doors opened on the 10th floor, and Grayson stepped into the sterile hallway. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of distant monitors filled his senses. He'd always hated hospitals. They represented the one thing he couldn't control, the unpredictability of human fragility. He found her room number easily enough, room 1047. Through the small window in the door, he could see her sitting up in bed, and his breath caught in his throat. Jules looked different. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore no makeup, but there was something luminous about her, something he'd never seen before. She was looking down at something in her arms, her face soft with an expression he couldn't quite name. Love. That's what it was. Pure, uncomplicated love. Grayson raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. In all his years of corporate negotiations and hostile takeovers, he'd never felt this uncertain, this afraid. He knocked softly. Jules's head snapped up, and her eyes widened in shock. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she carefully adjusted whatever she was holding and called out, "Come in." Grayson pushed open the door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was how small the room seemed, with both of them in it. The second thing he noticed was the baby, his son. The child was awake, looking up at Jules with those unmistakable gray eyes that Grayson saw in the mirror every morning. Dark hair, strong jawline even at 3 months old, and an alertness that seemed almost preternatural. "Hello, Jules." His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Grayson." She clutched the baby closer to her chest, protective and wary. "What are you doing here?" "I saw the photo." He stayed near the door, afraid that if he moved closer, he might do something reckless, like reach for the child, like break down completely, even though you deleted it. Jules' cheeks flushed pink. "That was a mistake. I didn't mean to send it." "Was it?" He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. "Was it a mistake? Or did some part of you want me to know?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her internal struggle playing out across her features. Finally, she looked up at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 8 months. "His name is Ezra," she said quietly. "Ezra Hale Moreau. He's 3 months old." The words hit him like a physical blow. "You gave him my name. He's your son." Grayson moved closer to the bed, and he could see Jules tense slightly. "When did you know?" 3 weeks after I left your office." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I took 6 pregnancy tests. I thought maybe the stress of our breakup was making me sick, but why didn't you tell me?" Jules laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I tried once. Your phone went straight to voicemail. I realized you'd probably blocked my number after I left that night. The message was pretty clear, Grayson. You didn't want the chaos of a family, remember?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from their years together. "I never blocked your number." "Then why?" "I changed my phone. New number, new everything. I thought it would be easier to..." He trailed off, the implications of his actions hitting him fully. "God, Jules, you tried to reach me." "Once," she said firmly. "I tried once, and when I couldn't get through, I decided you were right. You didn't want this life, and I wasn't going to beg you to be a father." Ezra made a small sound, drawing both their attention. He was looking directly at Grayson now, those gray eyes studying him with an intensity that made Grayson's chest tight. "Can I?" Grayson's voice broke slightly. "Can I hold him?" Jules hesitated for so long that Grayson thought she might refuse. Then slowly she shifted forward in the bed. "Support his head," she whispered, as she carefully transferred the baby into Grayson's arms. The moment Ezra settled against his chest, something fundamental shifted inside Grayson Hale. This tiny human, weighing barely 12 pounds, had just brought his entire world crashing down and rebuilt it in a single instant. "He's perfect," Grayson breathed, looking down into his son's face. "He's absolutely perfect." Jules watched them together, and despite everything, despite the pain and the anger and the 8 months of silence, her heart cracked open just a little bit more. Because Grayson Hale, the man who controlled billion-dollar empires and commanded boardrooms full of powerful people, was crying as he held his son for the first time. 3 days later, Jules was beginning to think she'd imagined the entire hospital encounter. Grayson had left that evening without making any promises or demands, simply kissing Ezra's forehead and telling her he'd be in touch. But what did that mean coming from a man who scheduled his life in 5-minute increments? Her small apartment in Brooklyn felt cramped after the spacious hospital room. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as she bounced Ezra gently, trying to soothe his fussing while simultaneously attempting to make coffee one-handed. New motherhood was proving to be an exercise in multitasking she'd never mastered. "Come on, sweet boy," she murmured, pressing her lips to the top of his dark head. "Mommy needs caffeine to function." The doorbell rang, and Jules froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her building security was notoriously strict. She peered through the peephole and her heart nearly stopped. Grayson stood in her hallway, looking oddly out of place in his expensive charcoal coat and perfectly tailored suit. But what made her breath catch wasn't his appearance. It was what he was carrying. A high-end coffee carrier and several bags that looked suspiciously like they came from Dean and DeLuca. She opened the door slowly, Ezra still in her arms. Good morning, Grayson said, his voice careful and measured. I brought breakfast. I thought you might be tired. Jules stared at him, completely speechless. This was not the Grayson she knew. The Grayson she'd dated would have sent an assistant with food, not shown up personally at 7:30 in the morning carrying gourmet coffee and pastries. How did you get past building security? She finally managed. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I bought the building. You what? Yesterday afternoon. Cash offer. The previous owner was very motivated to sell. He shifted the bags in his hands. May I come in? Jules stepped aside, still stunned. As he passed her in the narrow entryway, she caught his scent, that familiar combination of expensive cologne and something uniquely him that used to make her feel safe. Grayson set the bags on her small kitchen counter and began unpacking them with surprising efficiency. Fresh croissants, fruit salad, organic orange juice, and what looked like enough coffee to keep her awake for a week. Grayson, you can't just buy my building, Jules said, settling into her tiny dining nook with Ezra. Too late. He held up a steaming cup of coffee prepared exactly the way she liked it. Extra cream, no sugar. I also took the liberty of upgrading the security system and having all the common areas renovated. Your neighbors should be pleased. She accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. This is insane behavior, even for you. Is it? He sat across from her at the small table, looking absurdly large in her delicate dining chair. I missed 3 months of my son's life, Jules. I'm not missing anything else. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. There was a vulnerability there she'd rarely seen before, hidden beneath his usual confidence. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying I want to be involved. I want to learn how to change diapers and make bottles and whatever else fathers are supposed to do. He paused, watching Ezra with an expression she couldn't quite read. I want to know what his favorite lullaby is, and whether he likes to be rocked to sleep or if he prefers the swing motion. Jules felt her throat tighten. And what about work? Your empire? The board meetings and international conferences that can't possibly wait? Grayson was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about that. Before she could respond, Ezra began to fuss, the precursor to his full-scale meltdown that usually happened around this time every morning. Jules immediately started the familiar routine, checking his diaper, adjusting his position, making soft shushing sounds. Here, let me try. Grayson stood and moved around the table. Grayson, you don't have to. Please. The single word was so quiet, so completely unlike his usual commanding tone, that Jules found herself transferring Ezra into his father's arms. To her amazement, Grayson didn't look panicked or overwhelmed. Instead, he cradled Ezra against his chest and began walking slowly around her small living room, humming something under his breath. Within minutes, the baby had settled completely. How did you do that? Jules asked, genuinely stunned. I may have spent the last 3 days reading every parenting book published in the last decade, Grayson admitted, still swaying gently with Ezra, and I hired a pediatric nurse consultant to teach me the basics. You hired a... Of course you did. Jules laughed despite herself. You approach fatherhood like a hostile takeover. Is there another way? But he was smiling as he said it, and Jules felt something dangerous flutter in her chest. This softer version of Grayson was more devastating than his usual intensity. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text from her law firm, asking when she planned to return from maternity leave. The reality of her situation crashed back. She was a single mother with a mortgage and student loans, and Grayson buying her building didn't change the fact that she still needed to work. I have to go back to work next week, she said quietly. Grayson looked up from Ezra, his expression immediately serious. What do you need? The question was so simple, so direct, and yet it brought tears to her eyes. When was the last time someone had asked her what she needed? I need a nanny I can trust, and I need to know that you're not going to disappear again. She took a shaky breath. Because if you're going to be in his life, you need to really be in it. Not when it's convenient. Not between board meetings. Ezra can't be another item on your schedule, Grayson. He studied her face for a long moment, then looked down at their son, who had fallen asleep against his chest. Then I guess it's a good thing I cleared my schedule for the next 6 months. Jules nearly dropped her coffee cup. You did what? 6 months minimum. I've delegated my responsibilities to the executive team and made it clear that unless the building is literally on fire, I'm not to be disturbed. He met her eyes across the small room. I have some catching up to do. 2 weeks into their new routine, Jules was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. Grayson had been showing up every morning with coffee and staying until evening, learning everything from diaper changes to the precise way Ezra liked to be burped. He'd even figured out that their son preferred classical music during feeding time, something Jules had never noticed. She was folding tiny onesies on her couch while Grayson sat cross-legged on the floor, attempting to assemble what appeared to be the most complex baby swing ever manufactured, when her doorbell rang. "Expecting someone?" Grayson asked, looking up from the instruction manual he'd been studying with the intensity he once reserved for merger documents. "No," Jules frowned, settling Ezra in his bouncer before heading to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a striking woman with platinum blonde hair pulled into a sleek chignon, wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than Jules's monthly salary. She opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman's smile was practiced and cold. "You must be Jules. I'm Victoria Sterling. I think we need to talk." Jules felt her stomach drop. She knew that name. Victoria Sterling, heiress to the Sterling Hotel empire, had been photographed with Grayson at several high-profile events over the years. They'd never officially dated, but the tabloids had speculated endlessly about their close friendship. About what? About Grayson, of course. Victoria's blue eyes were calculating as they swept over Jules's casual yoga pants and oversized sweater. "May I come in?" Before Jules could respond, she heard Grayson's voice behind her. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" Victoria's smile brightened considerably. "Hello, darling. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your assistant said you were taking an extended leave, but she wouldn't say why." Her gaze shifted to the baby bouncer visible in the living room. "Now I see." Grayson moved to stand beside Jules, his presence both protective and tense. "This isn't a good time, isn't it?" Victoria stepped into the apartment uninvited, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Because from what I'm hearing, you've been playing house with your ex-girlfriend and her baby for quite some time now." "His baby," Jules corrected sharply, surprised by the fierce protectiveness that surged through her. "Ezra is Grayson's son." Victoria's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Of course he is, how convenient." She turned to Grayson, her expression softening into something that might have passed for concern. "Darling, you can't seriously be considering throwing your life away for this." "Careful." Grayson's voice carried a warning that Jules recognized. It was the tone he used in boardrooms when someone was about to make a very expensive mistake. But Victoria pressed on, apparently immune to his signals. "The board is asking questions, Grayson. Your investors are nervous. You can't just disappear for months and expect your empire to run itself." "My empire is fine." "Is it?" Victoria pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like financial reports. "Stock prices down 12%. The Singapore deal is stalling. Your competitors are circling like sharks." She looked up at him with perfectly manicured concern. "You're better than this, Grayson. You've worked too hard to let domestic complications derail everything you've built." Jules felt each word like a physical blow. Domestic complications. Is that what she and Ezra were? "Victoria." Grayson's voice was deadly quiet. "Leave. Now. Not until you listen to reason." Victoria moved closer to him, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that still carried across the small apartment. "We had plans, remember? The merger with Sterling Hotels, expanding into the European market together. You said you wanted a partner who understood your world." Jules watched this exchange feeling like she was intruding on something private and painful. Because Victoria wasn't wrong. She and Grayson did come from the same world. They spoke the same language of profit margins and market shares and strategic alliances. Ezra chose that moment to begin fussing, his small cries cutting through the tension in the room. Jules moved toward him instinctively, but Grayson was there first, scooping him up with the practiced ease he'd developed over the past 2 weeks. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice immediately gentle. "It's okay." Victoria watched this interaction with something that looked like genuine shock. "You're actually attached to it." "Him," Grayson corrected, his tone sharp. "And yes, I'm attached to my son. Your alleged son." The words hung in the air like a slap. Jules felt her face burn with humiliation and anger, but before she could respond, Grayson had handed Ezra to her and turned to face Victoria with an expression that could have frozen hell. "Get out." "Grayson, I'm only thinking of what's best for you. Get out." Each word was precise and final. "And if I ever hear you refer to my son as alleged again, you'll discover exactly how unforgiving I can be in business." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake. This little domestic fantasy won't last, and when it falls apart, you'll realize what you've thrown away." She gathered her coat and headed for the door. pausing only to look back at Jules with something that might have been pity. He'll get bored, you know. Men like Grayson always do. They need intellectual equals, not— She gestured vaguely at the modest apartment. This. The door closed behind her with a sharp click, leaving Jules and Grayson standing in the sudden silence. Ezra had quieted in Jules's arms, but she could feel her own hands trembling slightly. Jules, is she right? The words came out before she could stop them. About the business, I mean. Are you really losing everything because of us? Grayson turned to her, his gray eyes intense. Do you want me to leave? That's not what I asked. It's the only question that matters. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion he'd been hiding behind his confidence. Because I've spent the last 2 weeks learning what it means to be happy, Jules. Really happy. And if that costs me every dollar I've ever made, then so be it. Jules stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear. But there was something raw and honest in his expression that made her chest tight. She's beautiful, Jules said quietly. Victoria. And she's from your world. She's nothing. Grayson reached out and gently touched Ezra's cheek. This is everything. But as Jules watched him gaze at their son with such fierce tenderness, she couldn't shake Victoria's words. Men like Grayson always get bored, and despite everything that had changed between them, Jules wasn't sure she could survive being abandoned twice. Jules woke up to the sound of Ezra crying and the realization that Grayson wasn't there. For 3 weeks he'd been arriving before sunrise with coffee, and staying until well past midnight, learning the rhythms of their son's needs. But this morning her apartment felt hollow without his presence. She checked her phone as she lifted Ezra from his crib. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. The silence stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. Jules found herself listening for his key in the door, watching for his familiar silhouette through the window. By evening, worry had transformed into something darker. When he finally appeared at 8 o'clock, she was feeding Ezra on the couch, her laptop balanced precariously on the armrest as she tried to catch up on case files for her return to work. I'm sorry, he said immediately, setting down his usual coffee offering. Emergency board meeting. It ran longer than expected. Jules looked up at him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd loosened his tie. Victoria was right, wasn't she? About the business. Grayson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as his tell when he was overwhelmed. It's complicated. Uncomplicated for me. He sat on the edge of her coffee table facing her. The board called an emergency session. Some of the major shareholders are threatening to force a vote of no confidence if I don't return to full-time operations immediately. Jules felt her stomach drop. And I told them that my family comes first. He reached over and gently stroked Ezra's cheek. I may have used some very colorful language to express exactly what they could do with their ultimatum. Despite everything, Jules almost smiled. How colorful. Let's just say my assistant will be sending several apology baskets tomorrow. His expression grew serious again. But Jules, there's something else. The Singapore deal. It's not just stalling. We lost it. To Victoria's father, actually. He swooped in with a better offer while I was unavailable. The weight of his words settled between them. Jules shifted Ezra to her shoulder, using the movement to hide her expression. How much did you lose? Enough. Grayson's voice was carefully neutral. The board is panicking. Stock prices are dropping. Our competitors smell blood in the water. Because of us. Jules said quietly. Because you chose to be here instead of there. Because I chose to be a father. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Jules looked down at Ezra, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, completely oblivious to the fact that his existence was causing his father's empire to crumble. What if Victoria was right? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if you're throwing your life away? My life is here. Grayson leaned forward, his intensity palpable even in the dim lighting of her living room. My life is watching Ezra discover his hands and learning that he hiccups when he laughs, and knowing that you hum off-key when you think no one's listening. Jules felt tears threaten. But for how long? What happens when the novelty wears off and you remember what you're losing? The novelty? Grayson's voice carried a sharp edge. Is that what you think this is? I think you're a man who's used to having everything he wants when he wants it. And right now, you want to play father. But what happens when playing becomes actual responsibility? When it's not cute anymore, but just hard? Grayson stood abruptly, pacing to her small window that overlooked the street. You think I don't know hard? I've been working 18-hour days since I was 22, Jules. I've built something from nothing, fought for every success I've ever had. You think taking care of my son is somehow beyond my capabilities? I think you've never had to put anyone else's needs before your own for more than a few weeks. Jules's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. And I think when you realize what that actually means, really means, you'll resent us for it. He turned from the window, his gray eyes flashing with something between hurt and anger. So what are you saying? That I should just walk away? Abandon my son because you're afraid I might do it later anyway? I'm saying maybe Victoria was right about one thing. Maybe we're too different. Maybe what we had was never going to be enough to bridge the gap between your world and mine. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but once they were spoken, she couldn't take them back. The silence that followed was deafening. Grayson stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing her words, filing them away in that analytical mind of his. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Is that what you really think? That I'm here because I'm bored? That my son is some kind of temporary distraction? I don't know what to think anymore. Jules clutched Ezra tighter, as if he could anchor her against the storm she felt building between them. All I know is that 3 weeks ago you were willing to let me walk away forever, and now you're here, claiming that everything's changed, that family comes first. But people don't change that dramatically, Grayson. Not really. Don't they? He moved closer and she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. Because I'm pretty sure the man who walked into that hospital room 2 weeks ago died the moment he held his son. I'm pretty sure everything I thought I knew about what mattered just got completely rewritten. Jules wanted to believe him. God, how badly she wanted to believe him. But Victoria's words echoed in her mind. Men like Grayson always get bored. Your phone has been buzzing nonstop for the past hour, she said instead of responding to his declaration. Your empire is crumbling, and you're sitting in my tiny apartment arguing with a woman who can't even afford to fix her leaky faucet. How is this sustainable? Grayson glanced at his phone, which was indeed lighting up with what appeared to be an endless stream of urgent messages. For a moment she saw him waver, saw the part of him that was used to being indispensable, irreplaceable, constantly in demand. Answer it, she said softly. We both know you want to. He looked at her for a long moment, then at his sleeping son, then back at the phone. Jules held her breath, wondering if this was the moment when reality would finally crash through his fantasy of domestic bliss. Instead, Grayson picked up his phone and turned it off completely. There, he said, tossing it onto her coffee table. Problem solved. But Jules could see the cost of that gesture in the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands clenched briefly before he forced them to relax. And she realized with devastating clarity that loving someone sometimes meant protecting them from their own noble impulses, even if it broke your heart to do it. Jules woke up alone again, but this time she'd expected it. The previous night had ended with Grayson sleeping on her couch after their argument, both of them too emotionally drained to continue fighting. She'd heard him leave before dawn, his footsteps careful and quiet in deference to the sleeping baby. What she hadn't expected was to find an envelope slipped under her door. Her name was written on the front in Grayson's precise handwriting. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper and a key. Jules, apartment 4B is now yours. No rent, no strings attached. The lease is in your name only. Ezra deserves more space, and you deserve not to worry about money while you're figuring out what comes next. I've also set up a trust fund for Ezra. His education, healthcare, and future are secured regardless of what happens between us. I need you to know that loving you both isn't a burden I'm carrying. It's the only thing that's ever made sense. But I also need you to know that I heard what you said last night. All of it. Jules read the note 3 times before the words fully sank in. Then she looked at the key in her palm. A simple brass key that represented security she'd never imagined having. Her phone rang. Her mother. Jules, honey, I just saw the most interesting news article. Her mother's voice carried that particular tone that meant trouble. About some billionaire businessman and his secret family. There was a photo of you leaving the hospital with a baby. Jules's blood ran cold. What? The article said Grayson Hale has been mysteriously absent from his company for weeks, and sources suggest it's because he's been playing house with an ex-girlfriend and her child. They're questioning whether the baby is even his. Mom, I have to go. Jules, wait. Is this man Ezra's father? Because if he is, and you haven't told us... Jules hung up and immediately called Grayson. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the lobby of Hale Biotechnologies with Ezra in her arms, demanding to see Grayson. The security guard looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Mr. Hale is in an all-day board meeting. He specifically requested no interruptions." "I'm not an interruption. I'm the mother of his child." The guard's expression shifted to something like recognition, and Jules realized he'd probably seen the news article too. "Let me call his assistant." 5 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair appeared in the lobby. "Ms. Moreau? I'm Margaret, Mr. Hale's assistant. He's told me so much about you and little Ezra. I need to see him. It's urgent." Margaret glanced around the lobby, noting the curious stares they were attracting. "The board meeting is intense, but I think you should know what's happening up there." She led Jules to a private conference room on the 15th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city. Margaret closed the door and turned to face her. "The board is giving him an ultimatum," Margaret said without preamble. "Return to full-time operations immediately and end his personal distractions, or they'll invoke the clause in his contract that allows them to remove him as CEO." Jules felt the room tilt slightly. They can do that? If they can prove his personal life is negatively impacting the company's performance? Yes. And with the Singapore deal falling through and stock prices dropping? Margaret shrugged sadly. They have grounds. What does that mean for him? It means he'd lose control of the company he built. He'd still own shares, but he'd have no say in how it's run. Everything he's worked for would be in someone else's hands. Jules sank into one of the leather chairs, Ezra stirring in her arms. "And he's up there right now, fighting for it. He's up there right now choosing." Margaret's voice was gentle but clear. "And I think we both know what he's going to choose." As if summoned by her words, the conference room door opened. Grayson walked in looking like he'd aged years in the span of hours. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and there was something defeated in his posture that Jules had never seen before. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but his voice held no irritation, only exhaustion. "I saw the news article. I needed to know if you were okay." Grayson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Am I okay? Let's see. My board just voted me out as CEO, effective immediately. My company is now being run by a man who's planning to sell it to the highest bidder within 6 months. And the woman I love thinks I'm going to abandon her and our son because I might get bored." Jules felt tears prick her eyes. "Grayson, but you know what the really funny part is?" He moved to the window, staring out at the city below. "I don't care. I walked out of that boardroom, and all I could think about was getting home to you and Ezra. Not because I'm playing house or because it's some kind of novelty, but because that's where I belong." "You just lost everything," Jules whispered. "No." He turned to face her, and despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the defeat and the monumental loss, his eyes were clear. "I lost a company. I still have what matters." Jules stood up, carefully adjusting Ezra in her arms. "They did this because of us. Because you chose us over your responsibilities. I chose love over fear, Jules. I chose being present for my son's life over profit margins and board meetings. If that's irresponsible, then I'll wear that label proudly." Margaret cleared her throat softly. "I should mention there's been some interesting developments. It seems Victoria Sterling orchestrated much of this. She's been feeding information to the press and influencing board members. There's talk that Sterling Hotels is planning a hostile takeover now that you're no longer in control." Grayson's expression darkened. "Of course she is. There's more," Margaret continued. "The Singapore deal we lost? Sterling Hotels got it by using proprietary information that could only have come from someone with inside access to our proposal. That's corporate espionage." Jules watched Grayson's face transform as he processed this information. She could see the businessman in him awakening, calculating possibilities and revenge scenarios. But then Ezra made a small sound, and Grayson's attention immediately shifted to his son. "None of that matters right now," he said quietly. "What matters is that I have a family to take care of, and apparently a lot more time to figure out how to be a good father." Jules felt something break open in her chest. This man, this brilliant, driven, impossibly successful man, had just lost his life's work, and his first concern was learning to be a better parent. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm scared that you'll wake up tomorrow and realize what you've given up. I'm scared that loving us won't be enough when the reality of a normal life sets in. I'm scared that—" Grayson crossed the room in 3 quick strides and kissed her, cutting off her words. It was desperate and gentle and full of everything they'd been afraid to say to each other. When they broke apart, He rested his forehead against hers. "I'm scared too," he whispered. "I'm scared I'll mess this up. I'm scared I don't know how to be the father Ezra deserves or the partner you need. But I'm not scared of losing my company or my money or any of the things I used to think mattered." Jules looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Grayson glanced at Margaret, who was discreetly pretending not to watch their reunion. Now we go home. And tomorrow we start figuring out what comes next." 6 weeks later, Jules was beginning to understand what happiness without fear felt like. The new apartment was twice the size of her old one, with huge windows that filled the space with natural light, and enough room for Ezra to eventually crawl around without bumping into furniture every 3 feet. More importantly, Grayson had settled into their life with a determination that surprised everyone, including himself. Gone were the $1,000 suits replaced by jeans and sweaters that didn't require dry cleaning when Ezra spit up on them. His days were structured around feeding schedules and nap times instead of board meetings and conference calls. Jules found him in the kitchen that morning, standing at the stove with Ezra balanced expertly in one arm while he attempted to flip pancakes with the other. The baby was wide awake and alert, seemingly fascinated by his father's culinary efforts. "You know there are easier breakfasts to make one-handed," Jules said, tying her robe around her waist as she padded barefoot across the hardwood floor. "Ezra specifically requested pancakes," Grayson replied seriously, not taking his eyes off the pan. "He's very particular about his weekend breakfast preferences." Jules laughed, a sound that came easier these days. "Oh, he told you that, did he? We had a very in-depth conversation while you were sleeping. He also mentioned that he'd like a puppy and a college fund that includes graduate school. He's very advanced for 4 months old." Grayson turned to smile at her, and Jules felt that familiar flutter in her chest. He looked younger somehow, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. There were laugh lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his hair was slightly mussed from sleep. "Coffee's ready," he said, nodding toward the counter where her favorite mug waited, steam rising from the perfectly prepared cup. As Jules reached for it, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her law firm, asking if she'd reconsidered their offer to make her a junior partner. She'd been putting off the decision for weeks, torn between the career opportunities she'd worked toward for years and the life she was building here. Grayson noticed her expression. "Work? Partnership offer," she said, showing him the message. "They want an answer by Monday." He was quiet for a moment, focusing intently on transferring pancakes to a plate. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know." Jules settled onto one of the bar stools, accepting Ezra when Grayson handed him over. "It's everything I've worked for. The financial security, the prestige, the career advancement. But the hours would be insane. 60, 70 hours a week. I'd miss everything. First smiles, first words, first steps." She looked down at Ezra, who was studying her face with those serious gray eyes. "I don't want to be the parent who's always at the office." Grayson set a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of her, then leaned against the counter. "You know, I've been thinking about that myself lately." "About what?" "About what I want to do next. I mean, I can't exactly put former billionaire CEO on my resume and expect to get hired anywhere." Jules looked up at him sharply. Despite his apparent contentment with their domestic life, she'd been wondering when the reality of his professional exile would hit him. "Are you having second thoughts? About us?" "Never." His voice was firm and immediate. "About my career? Definitely. I've been talking to some people, quietly, about starting something new." "Like what?" Grayson pulled out his laptop and opened it on the counter. "What if I told you I've been developing a business plan for a legal aid foundation? Free representation for families dealing with medical bankruptcies, wrongful terminations, housing discrimination, cases that big firms won't take because they're not profitable enough." Jules nearly choked on her coffee. "You want to start a nonprofit? I want to start something that matters, something that helps people instead of just making money." He turned the laptop toward her, showing detailed financial projections and mission statements. "I've been researching it for weeks. I have enough liquid assets to fund it for the first 3 years, and after that, we'd seek grants and donations." Jules stared at the screen, scrolling through pages of research and planning. It was thorough, professional, and completely unlike anything she'd ever imagined Grayson being interested in. "This is incredible," she said softly. "But why legal aid? Why not biotech or something you already know?" Grayson moved around the counter to sit beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Because I've been watching you for the past 2 months. I've seen how passionate you get when you talk about helping people who can't afford good legal representation. I've seen how frustrated you get with the system that prioritizes profit over justice." Jules felt tears prick her eyes. "You did this because of me. I did this because of us. Because I want to build something we can both believe in." He reached over and gently touched Ezra's hand. "Something our son can be proud of." Jules was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was offering. Not just a job, but a partnership. Not just financial security, but purpose. "There's something else," Grayson said, his voice suddenly nervous. "The foundation would need a lead attorney. Someone with experience in civil rights law. Someone who understands what it's like to fight for people who don't have power or money." "Grayson, before you say anything, let me finish." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "I know this is crazy. I know it's a complete career change for both of us. But Jules, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to wake up every morning knowing that what we're doing matters. I want Ezra to grow up seeing his parents fight for people who need help. I want us to build something together." Jules looked at him, this man who had restructured his entire existence around love and family and purpose. 6 months ago, he'd been focused solely on profit margins and market domination. Now he was proposing they start a legal aid foundation together. "What about the partnership at my firm?" she asked. "What about it? They'll find another junior partner. But how many chances do we get to change people's lives?" Jules felt something shift inside her chest, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. She thought about the cases she'd always wanted to take but couldn't, because they weren't profitable. The families she'd met who needed help but couldn't afford it. The difference they could make together. "I have one condition," she said finally. Grayson's face lit up with hope. "Anything. We do this as equal partners. Not you funding my career, but us building something together. 50-50 all the way. Deal." He leaned over and kissed her forehead, then Ezra's. "So is that a yes?" Jules looked down at their son, who was now gripping her finger with his tiny fist, then back at Grayson. For the first time in months, she could see their future clearly, not just as co-parents, but as true partners in every sense of the word. "That's a yes," she whispered. And for the first time since they'd found each other again, Jules wasn't afraid of what came next. 3 months after they'd started planning the foundation, Jules was beginning to believe that maybe they really could have everything, until Victoria Sterling walked into their temporary office space with a smile that could freeze hell. Jules looked up from the case files spread across her desk to find the woman who'd tried to destroy their happiness standing in their doorway, like she owned the place, which, Jules realized with growing dread, she might actually do. "Hello, Jules." "Grayson." Victoria's voice was honey-sweet and completely venomous. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I was in the neighborhood and thought we should have a little chat." Grayson emerged from the back office where he'd been reviewing foundation bylaws, Ezra sleeping peacefully in a carrier strapped to his chest. The sight of the powerful businessman turned devoted father, wearing his 6-month-old son like a piece of casual attire, would have been endearing if not for the immediate tension that filled the room. "Victoria." His voice was carefully neutral. "What do you want?" "Straight to the point. I always did admire that about you." Victoria settled into one of their mismatched chairs with the kind of casual elegance that made Jules acutely aware of her own jeans and oversized sweater. "I wanted to congratulate you both on your little venture here. Legal aid for the underprivileged. How wonderfully altruistic." "Cut the pleasantries," Jules said, her protective instincts flaring. "Why are you really here?" Victoria's smile widened. "Well, since you asked so nicely, I'm here because I own this building. And I'm afraid I'm going to need you to vacate by the end of the week." Jules felt the blood drain from her face. "You what?" "Bought it yesterday. Cash offer. Well above asking price. The previous owner was very motivated to sell." Victoria examined her perfectly manicured nails with studied nonchalance. "I'm planning some renovations that will require the space to be completely empty." Grayson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "How much do you want, Victoria?" "Oh, this isn't about money, darling. This is about you finally coming to your senses." Victoria stood and moved closer to them, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "I've been watching this little domestic experiment of yours with great interest. And while I admire your commitment to playing house, I think it's time you remembered who you really are." "I know exactly who I am," Grayson replied, his hand instinctively moving to support Ezra's sleeping form. "Do you?" "Because the man I knew, the man I was planning to build an empire with, wouldn't be content changing diapers and filing pro bono cases for the rest of his life." Victoria's voice dropped to an intimate whisper. I'm offering you a way back, Grayson. Sterling Hotels is acquiring Hale Biotechnologies next month. I could arrange for you to resume control, return to the life you were meant for. Jules felt her world tilt. And what's the price for this generous offer? Victoria's gaze shifted to her with barely concealed contempt. You walk away. You take your little bastard and disappear. Grayson returns to his real life, and everyone gets what they deserve. The word bastard hung in the air like a slap. Jules saw red, but before she could respond, Grayson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Get out. Grayson, be reasonable. Get out. Now, before I call security and have you removed. His voice was deadly quiet, the tone Jules remembered from their early days together when he was negotiating hostile takeovers. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. You're making a mistake. This foundation will fail within a year. You'll be broke, irrelevant, forgotten, and she'll leave you the moment things get difficult because that's what people like her do. People like me? Jules stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. You mean people who actually work for a living? People who don't inherit a daddy's fortune and use it to destroy other people's happiness? I mean people who don't belong in his world. Victoria snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. You're a temporary distraction, sweetheart. A rebound from his real life. Men like Grayson don't end up with women like you. They end up with women like me. You're right about one thing, Grayson said, his voice cutting through Victoria's tirade. I don't belong in your world anymore. I belong here with my family, doing work that actually matters. And if that makes me irrelevant in your eyes, then I'll wear that label proudly. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Jules could see the exact moment when she realized she'd lost, that whatever hold she thought she had over Grayson was gone, replaced by something stronger than ambition, or greed, or social status. Fine, Victoria said finally, gathering her composure like armor. Enjoy your little charity project while it lasts. But when this foundation collapses and she realizes what she's cost you, don't come crawling back to me. She turned on her heel and strode toward the door, but paused at the threshold. Oh, and about the building, I wasn't lying. You have until Friday. The door slammed behind her, leaving them in sudden, heavy silence. Ezra stirred slightly at the noise but didn't wake. His small fist curled against his father's chest. She's really going to evict us, Jules said quietly, sinking back into her chair. Probably. Grayson moved to the window, looking out at the street below. But you know what? I don't care. You don't care? Jules stared at him. Grayson, we've put everything into this place. Our savings, our plans, our future. No. He turned back to her, his gray eyes blazing with determination. We've put everything into each other, into this family, into the work we're doing. A building is just a building, Jules. We can find another space. With what money? Victoria will make sure no one in the city will rent to us. Then we'll go somewhere else. Boston, Philadelphia, anywhere but here. Grayson moved to her desk and sat on the edge facing her. Jules, look at me. She looked up at him, this man who had given up everything for her and their son, and felt tears threaten. 6 months ago, I would have taken her deal, he said quietly. I would have convinced myself that power and money were more important than love. But that man was empty, Jules. He was successful and wealthy and completely hollow inside. And now? Now I wake up every morning with purpose. I go to sleep every night knowing that what we did that day mattered to someone. I get to watch our son grow up and learn to walk and say his first words. I get to build something meaningful with the woman I love. He reached out and touched her cheek gently. Victoria can take our building, but she can't take this. She can't take us. Jules leaned into his touch, feeling some of her panic subside. What if she's right, though? What if this foundation fails? What if we can't make it work? Then we'll try something else. Together. Grayson's voice was firm and sure. Jules, I need you to understand something. Losing my company was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it brought me here. To you. To this life. Victoria thinks she's threatening me with irrelevance, but she doesn't understand that I was already irrelevant when I was living for profit margins and board meetings. Ezra chose that moment to wake up, blinking those serious gray eyes at his parents. Grayson carefully lifted him from the carrier and handed him to Jules, who immediately felt her anxiety ease at the solid weight of her son in her arms. So what do we do? She asked. Grayson smiled, and for the first time since Victoria had walked in, he looked genuinely happy. We pack up our files, find a new space, and keep changing the world one case at a time. And we do it together. Jules looked at him holding their son, this man who had chosen love over everything else he'd ever valued, and realized that Victoria had actually done them a favor, because now she knew, without any doubt, that Grayson Hale was exactly where he wanted to be. 1 year later, Jules stood in the doorway of their new foundation office in Philadelphia, watching Grayson attempt to teach 10-month-old Ezra how to stack blocks while simultaneously reviewing case files. Their son was more interested in putting the blocks in his mouth than building anything, but Grayson persevered with the kind of patience that would have shocked anyone who'd known him in his corporate days. The Hale Moreau Foundation for Legal Justice had helped 63 families in their first year, won 2 landmark housing discrimination cases, and somehow managed to turn a small profit. More importantly, Jules woke up every morning excited about the work they were doing instead of dreading another day of corporate law. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, Grayson's former assistant who had become like family to them. "Turn on Channel 6 News. Now." Jules grabbed the remote and switched on the small television in their conference room. The news anchor was in the middle of a story that made her blood run cold. Sterling Hotels filed for bankruptcy today following a federal investigation into allegations of corporate espionage and fraudulent business practices. Victoria Sterling, heiress to the hotel empire, was arrested this morning on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and corporate sabotage. The screen showed footage of Victoria being led away in handcuffs. Her perfect composure finally cracked. Jules called out to Grayson, who came running with Ezra balanced on his hip. "Is that?" he started. "Victoria, getting arrested for corporate espionage." Jules turned up the volume as the reporter continued. The investigation began when former Hale Biotechnologies executives came forward with evidence that Sterling had illegally obtained proprietary information to sabotage business deals. The FBI discovered a pattern of corporate manipulation spanning several years. Grayson sank into a chair beside Jules, both of them transfixed by the spectacle of Victoria's empire crumbling in real time. Ezra, oblivious to the drama, began babbling and reaching for the colorful blocks scattered on the conference table. "There's more," the reporter continued. "In a surprising turn of events, the Hale Biotechnologies board has unanimously voted to reinstate former CEO Grayson Hale, citing new evidence that his removal was based on false information provided by Sterling Hotels. The company's stock has surged 20% in after-hours trading on news of his potential return." Jules turned to look at Grayson, whose expression was unreadable. This was it, the moment she'd been unconsciously dreading for a year, the chance for him to reclaim everything he'd lost, to return to the world of power and influence and billion-dollar deals. "Grayson," her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I know." He was still staring at the television screen, where financial analysts were speculating about the impact of his potential return to corporate leadership. Jules's phone began ringing immediately, then Grayson's. Within minutes, both their phones were buzzing nonstop with calls from reporters, former colleagues, and board members. The outside world, which had left them alone for a year, was suddenly very interested in their quiet life again. Grayson stood up and switched off both phones, then moved to close the blinds on their office windows. The sudden silence felt heavy with possibility and dread. "Say something," Jules whispered, adjusting Ezra in her arms as he began to fuss. "What do you want me to say?" Grayson's voice was careful, neutral. "I want you to tell me what you're thinking. I want you to tell me that you're not considering it." "Aren't I allowed to consider it?" He turned to face her, and for the first time in months she couldn't read his expression. "It's my company, Jules. Everything I built from nothing, and they're offering it back." Jules felt her world start to tilt. "And us? What about us? What about the foundation? What about everything we've built here? What about it?" His voice was getting sharper. "We could hire other lawyers to run the foundation. We could fund it properly with corporate profits instead of struggling to make payroll every month. That's not the point, and you know it." Jules stood up, pacing to the window, despite the closed blinds. "This isn't about money, Grayson. It's about who you are, who we are together." "Maybe I'm tired of being poor," he said quietly, and the words hit her like a physical blow. Jules spun around to stare at him. "Poor? We're not poor. We have everything we need. Do we? When was the last time you bought yourself something new? When was the last time we went out to dinner somewhere that didn't require crayons and a kid's menu? When was the last time you didn't worry about whether we could afford Ezra's daycare?" The questions hung in the air between them, each one landing with devastating accuracy. Because he was right. They did worry about money. They did make sacrifices. They did live a smaller life than either of them had ever imagined. So that's it? Jules's voice was shaking now. A year of struggling together, and the moment someone offers you your old life back, you're ready to abandon everything we've built? I'm not abandoning anything. I'm talking about expanding it, growing it, making it sustainable. You're talking about going back to being the man who thought love was a distraction and family was chaos. Maybe that man had a point. The words came out harsh and immediate, and Jules saw Grayson's face change the moment he said them, but it was too late to take them back. Jules felt something inside her chest crack open. Get out. Jules, get out. Take your phone calls and your board meetings and your billion-dollar empire and get out. She was crying now, but her voice was steady. Because if that's what you really think, if you really believe that loving us has been a mistake, then you were right the first time. We don't belong in your world. Grayson stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with something. Then he picked up his jacket and headed for the door. I'll be back, he said quietly. Will you? Jules clutched Ezra closer to her chest. Because it feels like you already left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Jules alone with their son and the wreckage of everything she'd believed about their life together. For 3 hours, she sat in their conference room, staring at the television as financial news channels dissected Grayson's potential return to corporate power. Ezra had fallen asleep in her arms, completely unaware that his world was falling apart. When the door opened again, Jules looked up expecting to see Grayson. Instead, Margaret walked in carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression Jules had never seen before. Where is he? Margaret asked without preamble. I don't know. Taking meetings, probably. Negotiating his return to glory. Jules's voice was bitter. Margaret sat down across from her and placed the folder on the table. Before you write him off completely, you should see this. Jules didn't move. I don't want to see financial projections or corporate restructuring plans or... It's his resignation letter, Margaret said quietly. To the board. He wrote it an hour ago. Jules felt her breath catch. What? He called me from his lawyer's office, asked me to bring this to you. Margaret opened the folder to reveal a single sheet of paper in Grayson's precise handwriting. He's not taking the job, Jules. He never was. Jules read the letter with trembling hands. It was brief, professional, and absolute. Grayson Hale was formally declining the board's offer to return as CEO, citing his commitment to his current work in legal aid and his responsibility to his family. I don't understand, Jules whispered. Then why did he say those things? Why did he leave? Margaret's expression softened. Because he needed to be sure. He needed to know that he was choosing this life because it was what he truly wanted, not because he was afraid of the alternative. She reached across the table and squeezed Jules' hand. He's been planning this response since the moment the story broke, but he had to feel the weight of the choice first. Jules looked down at Ezra, who was beginning to stir in her arms, then back at the resignation letter. Where is he now? Waiting in the hallway. He's been out there for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to come back in. Before Margaret could say another word, Jules was on her feet and heading for the door. She found Grayson sitting on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and she could see that he'd been crying. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I'm so sorry, Jules. I don't know why I said those things. I don't know why I... She knelt down beside him, careful not to wake Ezra. You needed to know that this was really your choice. It was always my choice. From the moment I held him in that hospital room, this was always my choice. He reached out tentatively and touched Ezra's sleeping face. For a moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to have that kind of power, and it terrified me that some part of me missed it. And now? Grayson looked at her with those gray eyes that had first captured her heart years ago. Now I know that the only power that matters is the power to choose love, every day, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when the world is offering you everything you used to think you wanted. Jules felt tears slip down her cheeks. So what happens now? Now we go home. We put our son to bed, and tomorrow we get back to changing the world, one case at a time. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you'll still have me. Jules leaned forward and kissed him, gentle and sure. Always, she whispered against his lips. Always. And as they sat together in that hallway, their son sleeping peacefully between them, Jules knew with absolute certainty that they had chosen the right life, not the easy life, not the glamorous life, but the real life, the one that mattered. 5 years later, Jules woke up to the sound of small feet running down the hardwood hallway of their suburban Philadelphia home. She smiled before she even opened her eyes, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of 5-year-old Ezra's morning sprint to their bedroom. "Mommy! Daddy! The pancakes are burning." Jules sat up quickly, her hair tumbling around her shoulders as she tried to process this information. Beside her, Grayson was already throwing off the covers, his expression shifting from sleepy contentment to mild panic. "I told him I'd make breakfast while you slept in," he said, pulling on a t-shirt. How much damage could a 5-year-old do in 20 minutes? They found out quickly. The kitchen looked like a flour bomb had exploded, there was batter dripping from the ceiling fan, and smoke was indeed rising from the pan on the stove. But Ezra stood in the middle of it all, wearing his father's apron which dragged on the floor behind him, grinning with the kind of pride that only comes from creating beautiful chaos. "I made breakfast," he announced, his gray eyes so much like Grayson's, sparkling with mischief. "It's a surprise." Jules looked at Grayson, who was surveying the disaster with the same intense concentration he'd once reserved for corporate mergers. After a moment, he started laughing, the deep, genuine laughter that had become so much more frequent over the years. "It's definitely a surprise, buddy," he said, lifting Ezra into his arms, despite the flour covering both of them. "What do you say we clean this up together and then go out for pancakes? Can we go to the place with the funny-shaped ones?" "Absolutely." Jules watched this exchange from the doorway, still marveling at how natural Grayson had become at adapting to the unexpected. The man who'd once scheduled his life in 5-minute increments now rolled with flour explosions and impromptu pancake expeditions without missing a beat. An hour later, they were sitting in their favorite family restaurant, Ezra carefully cutting his Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes while chattering about his upcoming kindergarten graduation. Jules found herself studying both of them, her son, who was growing more confident and curious every day, and her husband, who still sometimes surprised her with how completely he'd embraced this life they'd built together. "Oh, I almost forgot," Grayson said, pulling out his phone. "Margaret called this morning. The foundation just got approved for that federal grant we applied for. Full funding for the next 3 years. Jules nearly choked on her coffee. "The housing discrimination program? All of it. Housing, employment, family law, everything." His smile was the same one she'd fallen in love with years ago, but warmer somehow, more grounded. "We can hire 6 new attorneys and open that satellite office in Camden." Jules felt tears prick her eyes. The Hale Moreau Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, helping over 300 families in the past 5 years, and winning several cases that had set important legal precedents. But more than that, it had given them both a sense of purpose that went far beyond anything they'd ever experienced in corporate law. "Daddy, why is Mommy crying?" Ezra asked, looking concerned. "Happy tears, sweetheart," Jules said, wiping her eyes. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're really, really happy." "That's weird," Ezra pronounced solemnly, then went back to his pancakes. Grayson reached across the table and took her hand. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I got a call yesterday from a journalist at the Washington Post. She's doing a follow-up story on Victoria." Jules felt her stomach tighten slightly. Victoria had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for corporate espionage and fraud, but her name still had the power to create a flutter of anxiety. What kind of follow-up? Apparently, several other business leaders have come forward with similar stories about her sabotaging their companies and relationships. The reporter wanted to interview us about our experience, about how we built something positive out of what she tried to destroy. Jules was quiet for a moment, watching Ezra carefully pour syrup on his remaining pancakes. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd have to discuss it with my wife and my business partner." Grayson's voice carried that note of respect that never failed to make her heart flutter. Even after all these years, he treated her as an equal partner in everything. "But personally, I think our story could help other people who've been through something similar. You want to do the interview? I want to show the world what real success looks like." He gestured around the restaurant, at their flour-covered son and their comfortable, unpretentious life. Not boardrooms and stock prices, but this: family, purpose, love that chooses to show up every single day. Jules looked at him across the table, this man who had given up an empire to build something better, and felt that familiar surge of gratitude for the path that had led them here. "Okay," she said, "let's tell our story." Later that afternoon, after they'd returned home and cleaned up the kitchen disaster, Jules found herself in their backyard watching Grayson teach Ezra how to throw a baseball. Their son was still too young to catch it consistently, but his determination was fierce and his laughter was infectious. The yard wasn't huge, nothing like the sprawling estates Grayson had once owned, but it was theirs. There was a vegetable garden that Jules had started last spring, a swing set that Grayson had built himself, after consulting several YouTube tutorials, and a sandbox where Ezra conducted elaborate construction projects with his collection of toy trucks. It was ordinary and perfect and exactly what she'd dreamed of all those years ago when she'd walked out of Grayson's office believing that love would never be enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Natalie. Saw the news about the grant. So proud of you both. Mom wants to know when you're bringing Ezra for another visit. Jules smiled, typing back. Soon. Tell Mom that Ezra's been practicing his French like she taught him. The relationship with her family had taken time to rebuild after the chaos of Ezra's early months, but they'd come to adore Grayson almost as much as they loved their grandson. Her mother particularly enjoyed reminding Grayson that she'd been right about him needing to learn how to be happy, a prediction she'd made within 5 minutes of meeting him. Mommy, look, Ezra called out, having successfully caught the ball for the first time. I did it. I saw, baby. You're getting so good at that. Grayson jogged over to where she was sitting on the back steps, slightly out of breath but grinning. Did you see that catch? Kid's got natural talent. He gets that from his father, Jules said, pulling him down to sit beside her. The athletic ability or the devastating good looks? The determination to keep trying until he gets it right. She leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him mixed with fresh air and sunshine, and maybe a little of the devastating good looks. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their son chase fireflies that were just beginning to appear in the early evening light. Jules thought about the article they'd agreed to participate in, about telling their story to the world. It seemed impossible that the life they were living now had grown out of such pain and uncertainty. Do you ever miss it? She asked quietly. The power, the influence, the feeling of being indispensable? Grayson was quiet for a long moment, and Jules could feel him really considering the question instead of just giving her the answer he thought she wanted to hear. Sometimes, he said finally. Not the stress or the politics or the endless meetings, but sometimes I miss the feeling of commanding a room, of knowing that when I spoke, people listened. Jules felt a flicker of the old fear, but his next words chased it away. But then I remember that the most important people in my life listen to me every day. When I read Ezra a bedtime story, he hangs on every word. When I tell you I love you, you believe me. When we argue about a case strategy, you challenge me to be better. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. I used to think power meant making people do what you wanted. Now I know it means having people who choose to stay. Jules felt tears threaten again, the happy kind that Ezra found so confusing. I choose to stay, she whispered. Even when I burn dinner? Even when you let our 5-year-old nearly burn down the kitchen? In my defense, I genuinely thought he understood the concept of low heat. Jules laughed, the sound carrying across their small yard where their son was still chasing fireflies with the single-minded determination that seemed to be his birthright. This was their life, messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Not the life either of them had planned, but the life they'd chosen and fought for and built together, one day at a time. As the sun set behind their ordinary suburban home, Jules realized that they'd found something Victoria Sterling, for all her wealth and influence, had never understood. They'd found that true success wasn't measured in dollars or power or social status. It was measured in moments like this one, when love felt as natural as breathing, and as strong as the foundation they'd built their entire world upon. Your participation means a lot to us, Jules murmured, stealing Grayson's old phrase from the YouTube channel they'd never actually made. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Grayson looked at her with mock confusion. What comments? The ones our son will write in his diary tonight about his parents being completely ridiculous. Ah, those comments. 5 stars, I hope? Definitely 5 stars. As fireflies danced around their laughing child and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jules knew that their story, messy and complicated and real, was exactly the kind of love story the world needed to hear. Not perfect, but true. Not easy, but worth everything. Would you have made the same choice Grayson did, giving up everything for love and family? Share your thoughts about what true success really means. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.